And here's the kicker, the Emus won. Not just a small skirmish, but a full-scale battle that was fought with military resources and yet ended in complete failure for the humans involved. How did this happen? Let's break it down. The origins of the conflict: emus versus farmers.
Fight!
The story begins in the early 1930s after World War I Australia was recovering from the war. And its farmers were already under immense pressure due to economic hardship. The Great Depression had hit, and the farmers were struggling to make ends meet. Many of them had land in Western Australia, which was plagued by a new threat, an invasion of emus. The emus were migrating from inland areas to coastal regions, and in the process, they found fertile farmland that seemed perfect for their needs. These birds, typically large, flightless, and capable of running up to 50 kilometers per hour, decided to make a home on these farmlands. The emus would attack crops, particularly wheat, and caused widespread destruction to the farmers' livelihoods. It wasn't just a few emus either. There were tens of thousands of them. According to estimates, around 20,000 emus descended on the farmland, looking for food and shelter. To put it mildly, the emus were a significant threat. They were eating crops, trampling fields, and making it nearly impossible for farmers to grow anything. The military response: enter the soldiers. So, in an attempt to deal with this unexpected enemy, farmers turned to the government. The Australian government, under Prime Minister Stanley Bruce, decided to send in the military. After all, it wasn't just a matter of protecting crops, it was about saving the economy. The farmers had been fighting a losing battle for months, and it was time to bring in some real firepower. The government authorized the use of soldiers, and in November 1932, the Emu War officially began. The plan was simple: send in the army armed with machine guns to decimate the emu population and save the crops. How could such a large flightless bird pose a serious threat to trained soldiers with military equipment? The soldiers, led by Major G.P.W. Meredith, had their machine guns ready. The idea was to use the powerful weaponry to wipe out the emus in large numbers, but what followed wasn't exactly a victory. The soldiers first encountered the emus in the fields of Western Australia near Campion, but the emus, despite their size, were remarkably fast. The birds scattered into the dense scrub, and the soldiers struggled to hit them. The emus were not easy targets. In the first battle, around 1,000 birds were reportedly encountered. The soldiers fired thousands of rounds of ammunition, but after all that, only around 50 emus had been killed. The rest had scattered or managed to escape. The situation was frustrating. The emus were elusive, agile, and could run faster than the soldiers could track them. Moreover, the terrain made it difficult for the soldiers to get close to the birds. The birds didn't engage in direct combat. Instead, they used their speed and agility to avoid the soldiers. The machine guns weren't proving effective, and the birds were winning. The war drags on, a humiliating struggle. As the war continued, the soldiers found they weren't winning. Despite being armed with powerful weapons, they were unable to make much progress. The birds seemed to be outwitting them at every turn. They would group together, and when soldiers tried to attack them, they would scatter in every direction, making it nearly impossible to hit them. Over the next few days, the soldiers had several more attempts to curb the emu population. They were met with failure. The emus proved remarkably resilient. In one instance, the soldiers fired at a group of emus from a distance, and while some of the birds were hit, most of them escaped. Final failures, a victory for the emus. By December of 1932, after weeks of intense fighting, the government realized that they weren't going to win. The military's machine guns weren't enough to defeat the emus, and they weren't prepared for the cunning tactics that the birds employed. The soldiers were exhausted, their ammunition was running low, and the emus were still outnumbering them. The government eventually withdrew the army, officially ending the war after just a few weeks of fighting. In total, an estimated 1,000 to 2,500 emus were killed, but considering the size of the emu population, around 20,000, this was hardly a dent in the overall number. Public reaction, the absurdity of the situation. The aftermath of the Emu War was a source of national embarrassment for Australia. Newspapers mocked the government's failure to deal with what had become a ridiculous situation. The Emu War quickly became a source of satire, with the absurdity of it all becoming the subject of jokes and cartoons. How could a group of well-armed soldiers be bested by a group of flightless birds? In the years that followed, the Emu War became a curious chapter in Australian history. People look back at it as a symbol of the unlikeliness of life, where sometimes the odds are so stacked against you that it feels as though you are destined to lose, even in the face of overwhelming firepower. The Emu War's legacy, a struggle of man versus nature. The end of the military involvement didn't, however, signal the end of the emu problem. The government eventually turned to other methods to control the emu population. Farmers were given more effective weapons like rifles, and the government introduced new strategies, including bounty systems, to help farmers deal with the birds. But despite the initial military defeat, the Emu War has remained a memorable story in the annals of history. It's often cited as a bizarre and comical episode where humans were outsmarted by animals. It serves as a reminder of the unpredictability of nature and how sometimes even the best plans can fail in the face of the most unexpected challenges. The aftermath, the government's response. After the failure of the military intervention, the Australian government found itself facing a bizarre situation. The Emu War had become a national embarrassment. The soldiers, armed with heavy artillery, were unable to subdue a population of flightless birds. The media had a field day with the absurdity of it all, and political leaders were left scrambling for a solution that would salvage their reputations. Emus were still wreaking havoc on the farmlands. The initial reaction from the military had been a disaster, but the problem was far from over. In light of this, the government shifted its approach. Military intervention was out of the question, and it was clear that more conventional methods would need to be explored. The plan was adjusted to focus on controlling the birds rather than trying to eliminate them entirely. Bounty system, a new tactic. With the military pulling out, the Australian government turned to a different kind of strategy, the bounty system. Instead of sending in soldiers, the government decided to offer rewards to farmers who killed emus. The idea was to turn the farmers into a type of emergency response team, encouraging them to take action on their own to reduce the emu population. This was a more decentralized and perhaps less effective method. While it did result in some emus being killed, it was still far from a solution. The emus continued to be a major problem for farmers, and the bounty system proved to be a less than ideal solution. One reason the bounty system wasn't working as well as expected was because of the sheer scale of the problem. The emus were scattered across large areas of farmland, and farmers often had limited resources to track down and kill enough birds to make a significant dent in the population. The emus continued resistance, how the birds survived. Despite the various attempts by the government and farmers to reduce their numbers, the emus kept fighting back. And while the military might have been outclassed in the Emu War, the birds were not entirely without their own challenges. The farmers began to find more creative ways to deal with the birds, from building fences to protect their crops, to using more efficient rifles to shoot them. Still, the emu's remarkable ability to evade capture and adapt to their environment gave them the upper hand. Their long legs allowed them to sprint away at incredible speeds, often outrunning farmers and soldiers alike. As the years went on, the emu population continued to cause havoc on the farmland. In a twist of irony, the Emu War, despite the efforts and resources spent, didn't result in the complete eradication of the birds. Instead, they adapted, learned, and survived. The human efforts to take them down had not worked as expected, and the emu population remained large. Public reaction: the Emu War becomes a punchline. By the time the Emu War had officially ended, the public had turned the event into a joke. Cartoons were drawn, comedic skits were performed, and the Emu War became a symbol of the unexpected and often comical nature of human history. The soldiers who had been sent to fight the emus were ridiculed in the media, and the government's attempt to solve the problem with military force was seen as an embarrassing failure. People across the country laughed at the situation, and the Emu War became a source of satire in the popular culture. In some ways, this comedic response helped to minimize the embarrassment that the government had felt in the wake of the war. Instead of letting the situation fester and remain a source of humiliation, the public adopted a more lighthearted view of the event, turning it into something they could laugh about rather than something that had undermined the country's credibility.